Hi, friends. Let's get ready to read. Can't You Make Them Behave, King George? By Jean Fritz. Before George III was either king or the third, he was just plain George, a bashful boy who blushed easily. His toes turned in when he walked, and his teachers nagged him about being lazy. Now, of course, as everyone knows, a king should not blush or turn in his toes or be lazy. But George didn't think so much about being king. His grandfather, George II, was king at the moment. And when he died, George's father, Frederick, would be king. And not until Frederick died would George have to worry about his turn. So he went on blushing and turning his toes. He daydreamed and sometimes drew pictures on the margins of his school papers. Once, after a scolding, he put tar on his teacher's seat so that when the teacher sat down, he had a hard time getting up. Then suddenly, on March 20th, 1751, when George was 12 years old, his father died. And George, instead of being just plain George, was George, Prince of Wales. The next king. What was more, everyone expected George to start behaving like the next king, right now. "Take your elbows off the table, George," his mother would say. "Be a king." "Don't gobble your food, George. Do you want to look like your Uncle Cumberland?" "Stand up straight, George. Kings don't slouch." He was surrounded by private tutors, who from morning to night gave him arithmetic problems to solve, history lessons to learn, Latin passages to translate. They told him to turn his toes, to speak up, to keep still, to be a man, to get to work. Sometimes George sulked under so much instruction. Once, after a particularly hard Latin passage written by an old Roman named Caesar, George wrote on his paper, "Mr. Caesar, I wish you would go to the devil." But for the most part, he tried to do what he was told. He paid particular attention to his favorite tutor, Lord Bute, who seemed to know all the rules for the king business. And since he was going to have to be king, George decided when the time came, he would be a good one. He would be a father to his people. The time came on October 25th, 1760, when George was 22 years old. His grandfather died. Suddenly, there was George, all by himself, the new king. The first thing he did was gallop off to see Lord Bute and check all the rules. If he was going to be a good king, he wanted to start off right. And he did. He even looked like a king, tall, auburn hair, with well-shaped legs and toes going in the right direction. Occasionally he had pimples. People noticed, but never more than one or two at a time. When he made a speech, he stood straight and spoke in a strong voice. At parties, he didn't just stare at the floor, as his grandfather had done. He mixed with his company, and he didn't just hold out his hand for ladies to kiss. He kissed the ladies. John Hancock, who was visiting London, wrote back to America. The new king was good-natured and well-liked. "Good evening, my dear." But of course, what a king needed was a queen, and George III refused to be crowned until he had a queen to be crowned with him. He sent scouts scurrying through Europe to find what princesses were available. There turned out to be 7 princesses. One princess was fond of philosophy, and the king said he didn't want that. One was too young. 2 were stubborn. One had a grandfather who had married a druggist's daughter. One had a mother who had been in jail. The king said no to all of them. At the bottom of the list was 16-year-old Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg, a state in the North Germany. Princess Charlotte had rather a large mouth, but otherwise the king could find nothing wrong with her. So he said yes, and she said yes, and he made the plans. Yes, yes. First, the king sent for the princess's measurements. Then he supervised the making of her wedding dress. It was to be silver and white gown, with a mantle violet velvet lined with ermine and fastened on one shoulder with a bunch of pearls. He ordered a diamond tiara, and he had the royal yacht repainted and renamed Charlotte. He picked out 11 bridesmaids and ordered their clothes. Indeed, there was no detail that the king did not see to, even though in the midst of preparations he came down with chicken pox. Meanwhile, Princess Charlotte, who didn't want to leave home at all, picked out all the herbs in her private herb garden and all the flowers in her private flower garden, and she gave them away to the poor. She practiced playing God Save the King on her harpsichord and learned to sing the words. Since she didn't speak English, this was not easy, but she practiced and practiced. She even made the royal yacht crossing the North Sea when everyone else in her party was too seasick to sit up. Princess Charlotte and King George met at 3 in the afternoon of September 8th, 1761, and they were married at 9 the same evening. The princess's wedding dress fit all right, but the king had counted too much on that bunch of pearls. The ermine mantle was so heavy that she had a hard time keeping the dress on her shoulders. But she said, "I do," and he said, "I do." Then they went to the palace, and Charlotte sang and played God Save the King for the royal family. Now for the crowning. On September 22nd, King George and Queen Charlotte rode in sedan chairs to Westminster Abbey to be crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury. At the beginning of the ceremony, the Archbishop cried out, "I here present unto you George, the undoubted king of the realm." Everyone in the abbey shouted, "God save the king!" Then the Archbishop turned to all 4 points of the compass, north, south, east, west, and each time presented George, the undoubted king. Each time the people responded, "God save the king!" George and Charlotte put on their royal robes, received the royal regalia, made the promises they had to make, and finally the coronation was over. George had the crown on his head and felt like a real king. Not only father to thousands of people who were cheering outside the abbey, but father to all the people in his whole empire, including the men, women, and children far away in America. Indeed, King George was feeling so good that he seemed hardly to mind the things that went wrong at his coronation banquet. First were the candles. Lord Talbot, the king's chief steward, thought how clever would it be if suddenly all 2,000 candles in the banquet hall could light up at the same time just as the king, queen, and the guests came into the room. So he had the candles connected with strings of flax fuses, and when the people entered, he lighted the flax and the candles burst into flames just as he planned. When he had not planned was that the burning flax would turn thousands of sparks and shower down on the heads of those present. The ladies screamed, but no one was hurt. Then the chairs. Lord Talbot forgot to provide chairs for the king and queen. And since no one could sit down until the king and queen did, there was a great deal of standing about until the proper chairs were found. And when the last people could sit, there were not enough tables for them to sit at. No table for the Lord Mayor of London and the aldermen. So they were moved to the table reserved for the Knights of Bath, and the kings of the Bath were crowned in among the law lords. Then, because Lord Talbot thought he would be clever and save money, there wasn't enough food to go around. When some barons complained, Lord Talbot asked them if they wanted to fight. Worst of all was the horse ceremony. Lord Talbot was supposed to ride his horse into the banquet hall and up to the king and queen to pay his official respects. In preparing for the ceremony, Lord Talbot thought how clever it would be if his horse, instead of turning around, would back away from the king and queen. For days he trained on his horse to walk backward, and at the banquet, that's just what it did. But instead of walking forward to the king and queen and then backing away, the horse backed its rear end right up to the king and queen. Whoa! Anyway, mistakes or not, George III was king. And now what? Well, he had to be a good king, so he set about following the rules. A king, his mother told him, should not be fat, so he tried not to eat much. Fresh fruit and sauerkrauts were his favorite foods. Sometimes his guests thought he didn't want to be fat either. Once, a friend reported that after a whole day of hunting with the king, of galloping and leaping, of being popped into ditches and jerked over gates, what do you think the king offered him? A little barley water. Have some refreshments. Thank you, your majesty. Next, a king must be moral. So at once, King George issued a royal proclamation against the use of bad language. Furthermore, a king should not break promises. Once King George was thrown from a horse and was so black and blue that his doctors wanted to keep him in bed, but he had promised to go to the theater that night. So, up he got and off he went. A promise was a promise, he said. Smile, everyone. And of course, a king should have heirs. This took a little longer, but over the years, King George and Queen Charlotte had 15 children. George, Frederick, William, Charlotte, Edward, Augusta, Elizabeth, Ernest, Augustus, Adolphus, Mary, Sophia, Octavius, Alfred, and Amelia. Once a week, the family walked in pairs around the garden so the public could view them. Princess Augusta hated this. Come on, Augusta. Ugh. Another rule was that the king should be orderly. This was not hard for George. He loved order. Everything in its proper place, everyone at his own work. He liked to walk around the countryside and see that even the land was doing its job. He didn't like mountains. Useless things, he called them. And he was exact. If dinner set was at 8, he meant exactly at 8. When he measured the height of the princess, he measured it to a 16th of an inch. When he dated a letter, he included not only the date and year, but the hour and the minute he started writing. In addition, a king should be careful with money. So instead of having satin or velvet curtains around his bed, King George made do with white cotton ones, and he refused to have a rug in his bedroom. It would be unmanly, he said. And except on public occasions, he dressed plainly. He personally inspected the kitchen to make sure there was no waste. In order to cut down on number of servants, he had the queen's hairdresser serve meals. Remember, serve from left take away from rights.